if you think about it, right, your brain has just guided this death machine through risk after risk after risk after risk at incredible superhuman speeds from your home to that destination. And you never even got consulted by whatever automatic system it is that made that choice, okay? It's the great irony of our moment that the very moment that we were having the greatest breakthroughs in understanding how we connect to one another and make choices, along comes a technology that is poised to possibly wipe out both. Because again, these are people for whom the eye is functioning correctly and the brain is functioning correctly, but the connection that we know optic information moves through is cut. So there's some other thing that these people are catching visually, and we don't know what it is, right?
This week on GAEA Talks, Jacob Ward. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased to be here.
So, Jake, to begin with, do you want to give us an idea of who you are, your background, and what your thoughts are on AI?
Sure. So I'm a journalist, except for a couple of stints as a bartender and as a teacher. I've been a journalist my entire professional life, and covering technology for most of that time. And I came up in the mold of most tech journalists, which was this sort of business focus. And then for a time, I worked for I was the editor-in-chief of a big American publication, Popular Science magazine, which is a very optimistic, the future will be better and technology is why kind of magazine. And then as I continued to evolve as a journalist, I more and more began to sort of understand both the incentive structure of a lot of technology companies and the ways in which human circuitry was increasingly being played by those. And the social media era was a big part of that. That really got me going. Learning the power of attention as a product, the attention economy as an industry. And out of that, I was I was the co-host and writer the host and co-writer of a documentary series here in the United States called Hacking Your Mind, which was kind of a crash course in how human beings make decisions and the very automatic and instinctive ways we make the vast majority of our decisions. And until that experience, I had really thought of myself and of all of us as people who really make our own choices, that we're sort of, we are our own unique and beautiful snowflakes, and as a result, we make our own decisions. And out of that, I learned, because I got to travel the world and speak to all of these experts in how humans make decisions, so little of what I actually decide to do each day is actually a conscious choice. And at the same time that I was learning that, I was then also in my day job as a technology correspondent meeting all of these companies. This is transformer model, pre the technology that made ChatGPT possible. But even back then, when they were still using really clunky human reinforcement learning models, I could see this push among these companies to try and use that any kind of pattern recognition algorithm they could to predict and even shape human behavior. And the collision of those two worlds, the automatic way I was recognizing we make most of our decisions, and the incentive structure and burgeoning technology that would let people analyze and predict and maybe even guide those decisions, seemed to me to be a very scary thing coming. So I wrote a book called The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. I thought I was like 5 years early writing this thing, and instead it turned out I was like 2 financial quarters early. It came out in January of 2022. ChatGPT came out 9 months later, and suddenly I watched my thesis come to life. So that's my background.
I mean, that touches on a few, I think, really critical points that the majority of the public are just not aware of. I mean, my own personal experience in the music industry, as you develop artists, you have to explain a lot of the reality of putting a product together, but that product, the customer thinks is the majority of what they're buying. In this sense, music, right? In reality, music is a tiny thing. Obviously, It's got to be good. It's got to work. There's a lot of math to it. But if someone I trust says to me, this is a great track from Joe Bloggs. They go, well, he's got a good taste in music. I love his taste in music. We have a similar taste in music. If someone I've never met in my life says, this is a great track, I'm like, who the hell are you? Right? And you can see that people are buying into conforming within social circles. The reality of how you create a product, and a product being an album, the look, the image, the backstory, the emotional connection, it's everything surrounding it which is creating influence. And we may love some music, but when people love the Stones, they love the memories, the time, what it stands for. If people love any real great music, they fall in love with the character. It's that story. The moments that they saw them live. It's the girlfriend they had, the boyfriend that they had. It's everything around it. A good example of a song which really fits with that is The Summer of '69, Bryan Adams,
right.
encapsulating that point in time. So when I develop young artists these days, and I had this as an experiment, given they're a different generation. So as you said, a product of the thesis of the outcome of the social media generation. I said to them, you have to have an intentful decision of your image, what you wear, the brands that you like, what do you actually like? And they would regurgitate the marketing spiel and say, okay, what do you actually like? And the idea that their thoughts weren't their own just made them angry. They said, all right, let's do some profiling of what the demographic, what the audience, what the socioeconomic status is, the target customer of this brand, this brand, this brand, and this brand. Let's see where you fit. How many decisions were yours, and how many are you literally a product of marketing where you're the target audience? And when they stripped that back, they realized they don't even know what they like. They don't even know what decisions are their own. And that's really revealing. And I've never heard anyone actually really talk about this. So I find it fascinating that you spend so much time looking at this. It's really important to understand.
Yes.
Put technology on top, put the influence of AI in there. And, we don't want to get too negative because there's a huge amount of optimism with AI. But this is not an overnight accident. This is the evolution.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate? How did we get here?
Yeah, that's such an elegant way of getting to it. So so you're absolutely correct. So people in my experience, and I've been doing this for many years now, hate to be told that they are not in charge of their own choices. It is I think especially in the West, it really pushes against, especially in the United States, it pushes against the myth of, the rugged individualist making their own choices out on the frontier. But when you get into the science of it, just the circuitry by which we make our way through our days is such an automatic system. So here's a classic example of this. So, and we did this in the documentary. So if you've ever had the experience of in my case, when I have to drive my kid somewhere unusual in the morning, let's say they don't go to school and instead they have to go to a dentist appointment. If I have to drive them to that dentist appointment, as often as not, I will wind up driving them to school by accident, right? I'm sure we've all had this experience. You'd accidentally drive somewhere you didn't mean to go. And then you sort of come to in the parking lot and realize, oh, this isn't where I'm supposed to be. If you think about it, right, your brain has just guided this death machine through risk after risk after risk after risk at incredible superhuman speeds from your home to that destination. And you never even got consulted by whatever automatic system it is that made that choice. Okay. Now, how do we know that is a sort of a more automatic system than how your brain normally makes choices? Well, you and I especially can agree that if we were to swap places, if I came to the United Kingdom and you came to the United States and we had to drive, you're never going to tune out and accidentally drive somewhere you didn't mean to go. For me, driving in your nation is the most difficult cognitive challenge. I am terrified, right? Making a right-hand turn in your part of the world is the scariest thing ever. And I am so exhausted at the end of a drive because my brain has had to grab and grab and grab onto novel pieces of information every millisecond, right? Our brains are built as shortcut engines. All they want to do is take shortcuts. And you are describing in this discussion of how if someone you respect recommends music to you, you're more likely to like that. That is absolutely correct. You know the term social proof, this notion surfaced by this guy Robert Cialdini, who's a big expert in persuasion and how people are convinced to do things. And he has shown in experiment after experiment that if you can show someone that looks like them, this is the especially difficult thing. If you show them someone that they identify with culturally or ethnically or gender or whatever it is, if you can line up the factors so that you recognize yourself in that other person, you can be so much more influential on that person than you could otherwise. And that is an ancient piece of circuitry. It's how we stayed alive, was by not trusting enemy tribesmen, And so, but as you say, we hate to think about ourselves in that way. And the reason that AI is such a complex thing for us to be now building into our systems is that it is exactly what our brain is built for in terms of outsourcing decision making. So researcher after researcher has shown me over the years that whether it's outsourcing your decision making to your emotions, going with your gut, for instance, or outsourcing your decision making to your environment. This is why I, who can no longer drink alcohol, don't go into bars, right? The trigger of going into a bar is too strong. We are built to outsource our choices wherever we possibly can. And so along comes this seemingly omnipotent decision-making system that offers us the ultimate shortcut, right? And this is the thing that I just, if I could get anyone to understand anything, is that the central of the AI moment we are in right now is that the people using these systems believe that they are in charge, right? They are making decisions with the assistance of an AI, helper. But the deeper you go into AI assisted operations, the more you start to realize that the system is making the decision for you, really, and presenting it to you as a choice. And so you're just kind of ratifying outputs. You're not deliberating. And that is the difference between the part of our brain that drives our kid to school by accident and the part of our brain that drives for the very first time on the other side of the road. It is not being engaged in the same way. And we could also get into, of course, how these systems are increasingly being shown to be providing a narrower and narrower band of options. So each LLM, it turns out in big research that's come out pretty recently, are pushing toward a narrower and narrower set of outputs at the same time that you feel like you're accessing the world's creativity and information. And so that's the tension that I want people to understand, is not only is your own brain geared to take a shortcut wherever it possibly can, these systems that are being pushed on us as products are the perfect hack of that instinctive decision-making system.
It's the illusion of plausibility. And it's very difficult for, it sounds a bit mean, but different generations. I mean, I saw an odd animation this morning. It popped up on my YouTube feed early in the morning, and it was describing Generation X, which I think I fall in that category. And a lot of the people that I'm close with on a daily working basis would fall under that category. And I also work with older and younger, multiple generations. But that particular generation was it was more people of that generation in the United States, but I think it's a relatable global thing. The latchkey generation, where you would come home from school as a kid, your parents wouldn't be home, they'd be still at work, you'd make your own dinner, you would sort your own things out, you would go out to play, you'd come back, you would do things. There wasn't the internet, there wasn't phones, there wasn't all these things, so you had to learn to make decisions. You realized no one was coming to help you. If you made a decision and there was a consequence, there was a consequence. Mm-hmm. And at some point, your your parents came home. But growing up in childhood where you had that autonomy and you didn't necessarily have a direct safety net, there was probably more community than perhaps there is now. But when things changed and people started to have devices and the fear of bad things happening, that everyone became far more risk averse, the long-term psychological impact, and compound with more and more and more technology, more and more information flow, more and more fear in many ways, we've now ended up at the point where it is entirely possible to have the LLM style plausible outcomes where question answer compressed, and there's no reference point because that time didn't exist for a number of generations. There's no benchmark. So it sounds potentially ageist. It sounds like, well, you're just saying that because you're that generation. But I think these are key psychological factors that you can look at. And if you put people through different ways of growing up as children, and generationally seems to be something that generally the surrounding circumstances are relatively consistent for everyone, then it changes, but changes for everyone. Now, kids that have grown up only knowing social media, only being the product of algorithmic segmentation, this thin layer now, I mean, I've mentioned on the podcast, was at a dinner with Tim Berners-Lee talking about what he intended for the internet and the idea that an individual could have a sovereign space in the world. They could share, they could create a business, they could have ideas. Doesn't necessarily mean everything on the internet is right, wrong, or whatever. But now if you put everything through the internet into a thin monetized layer, which, as you say, is normalized, and that's the only benchmark that you've really got, to those that can see what the world was like before that, it's quite disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't realize that other world existed, how could they find it good, bad, or indifferent? It's all they've experienced.
Yeah. I mean, I think the good news is that we know there's the neuroplasticity in the brain throughout our lives that makes it possible to shift our way of thinking. The bad news is, unfortunately, growing up, as you say, in the generation we did, doesn't protect us against this, because the ability to make good decisions and to deliberate is a muscle that can atrophy over time. And a computer you can turn off, put in the closet, bring back out, and turn back on. And so as in any generation, I think if we build a system and begin to depend on a system to make these choices for us, especially one that dresses them up as if they are somehow our choices, I think I worry that we're going to, I mean, the way I've shorthanded my book is that AI, if we aren't careful, is going to do to our ability to make good decisions what Google Maps did to our sense of direction, right? It's just that your brain loses that capacity if it doesn't have to use it, because that's how we stayed alive. You tossed aside unnecessary work so that you could focus on the most important things of life. But now we're not even in that kind of world anymore. And so, the thing that I get worried about also is the way in which at the individual level this is happening, but where it really starts to metastasize is at the organizational level. So like so here in the United States, and I'm sure this is happening in the UK as well, is you're seeing more and more very important civic systems pulling in these sort of off the shelf pattern recognition systems to try and offload some work to. So there is something in the United States called SNAP benefits. And these are your benefits that come to you when you can't afford a home, you can't afford food. You can apply typically at the state level for a form of welfare. And in the state of Maryland, I spoke to these law professors who volunteer their time and their law students' time trying to go to administrative court to help people who have been wrongly denied their SNAP benefits. They're getting these form letters that say, you don't get welfare. You've been, this is a fraudulent claim. And so you don't get your benefits. And this is literally food, shelter. This is really, really important stuff. So these lawyers tell me that when they go to these administrative courts and they then force the agency to explain its decision-making, the agency says, oh, well, we're using this fraud detection system that we bought from this company. So then they'll bring in the company and they'll say, and make them try and explain the system. And no one in that room, not the agency using it, not the people who even make the system, can explain why this system rejected this applicant and greenlit this applicant. That's the crazy thing about these systems, is that they do not show their work. And yet we are so incentivized to treat their decisions as gospel when they save us human time. And that what can feel like you are accessing this very powerful, all of the marketing talks about how powerful these systems can be in your business and blah, blah, blah. The problem is it's actually making it very brittle. The point at which you think everything's running smoothly because this system is burbling away underneath is the point at which you have removed yourself from any real understanding of how choices are being made. And that's the danger to me, is the marketing and the human wiring makes it so easy to offload important decisions individually or especially organizationally. And just when you think it's going really well is when your organization is actually, it's most vulnerable, it's most fragile, because you've gutted the deliberative process that really is going to mean the difference between a successful organization and one that's not.
You raise a very valuable point there. And I just want to frame some context here. And it's just something for the listeners and the viewers to think about. And I've referred to elements before. So the amount of time that this new wave of technology has been here. So last night I was at dinner with someone who ran the educational part of one of the big tech companies. And he's doing something different now. But we discussed, if you're learning about specifically any form of artificial intelligence, you get a master's, you do a PhD, to train the people to undertake the courses, even if they're pre-trained and they're at the cutting edge today, 3-5 years later, in this time span, and these are people that would be trained to be experts. What do you think people in 5 years' time, if that's that's the education system's version of up to date, we know by next month it's out of date. Never mind 5 years. Then we apply that to enterprise, and we say people who are not in education, learning specifically in a high degree how AI works, the different forms, the different types, yet they're the people expected to understand how to make decisions of the adoption of technology that they don't really understand and have massive responsibilities in the first place, usually due to we need efficiency, which is not the right thing to do in any circumstance. Yes, if you have a problem to solve and you can get a benefit for efficiency, but then you should look at the risk of it, what the implications are. And we're so young into this phase, we're not going to see the consequences until 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time of the decisions made 1, 2 years ago. So naturally, that leads to a circumstance where people have surface knowledge at best to implement systems. And on the enterprise scale, and enterprise being large, whether that's government or private companies. But all of this is affecting the customers and the mass populace, to the point where, as you say, there are many, many circumstances where peculiarities happen. Now, the real core of it is really understanding what should you value in implementing anything. And my personal view, and that of the usual business I undertake, is trust and truth. And it sounds like a very simple thing. Can you trust it? Can you tell the truth? Now, anyone that knows anything about AI and understands how a transformer works knows by the very nature of how it works, you cannot guarantee it. And people say, well, I know about AI. I saw a YouTube video or something. I know what a transformer is. Isn't it Optimus Prime? You've, there has to be some base level of education in decision makers to understand the bare fundamentals of what are the negotiables and what are the non-negotiables.
Yeah.
And that should immediately rule out a lot of the implementation, which is diametrically opposed to the absolute bare basic necessity of what outcomes should be and what the impacts are acceptable or non-acceptable. And then efficiency shouldn't even come into it. I mean, undertaking anything within a court case and saying, right, we're potentially going to make all this evidence up. You would say in any fair country, no, don't be silly. You're going to make stuff up. This is a court of law. There has to be evidence. There has to be rationale. You can have opinions, judgments. You can have juries, but what is not negotiable is you can't forge evidence. But this is what's happened.
Yeah.
And there will be dramatic consequences. Equally, another thing that we've seen a lot, if you don't know what you're doing, or you do things with good intent, but you don't understand the basics, you will compromise fundamental security. That's intellectual property, that's illegal data sharing, that's data leaking. I mean, you understand how things work. So it becomes, for those who do understand, it's absolutely farcical that a lot of these systems are in place and in positions of trust where we can see what's going to happen. It just, the consequences have not truly unfolded yet. But equally on the positive side, there is an opportunity, which is why we do this channel, to inform decision makers that we can appreciate wouldn't be in a position to understand everything or the detail or the complexities, to educate to a level to say, can we ask the right questions to begin with? Because if you do, you're on the path and you're on the track to at least have a conscious decision, which circles back to what you were saying. Is it a pressure? Is it a conscious decision? Are we being influenced into doing things? Are we even aware that we have other choices? Because looking at the public narrative, I think this is the corporate equivalent of exactly what you've written your book about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, the feeling I have covering this industry for as long as I have and being sort of in these boardrooms and observing how so many of these choices are made, there's a very naive blind spot, it feels to me, in the implementation of these systems and the ways in which they've been rolled out to all of us. And that is that at the same time that you hear these folks all saying, well, this is the end of the need for conventional education, they are creating a system that is going to require the critical faculties given you by your education more than ever. And so to have a world that has for so long kind of over-indexed on sort of an engineered, optimal outcome kind of thinking, and it has now sort of had its way, right? Now that way of thinking has produced this AI world that we live in now. And yet at the same time, suddenly what's becoming clear is that these AI systems are only going to be able to make us a better version of ourselves if we have that better version built first, if we have the stuff in us that we want it to amplify. If instead we create a generation or multiple generations of people who don't even get the chance to be, bored long enough to have a creative thought, or connected with other people face to face well enough that they can learn how to work in a team. These are such important fundamental developmental gifts that we could that this system is built. If you let the market run wild with it, it is built to take those things away. And I really worry about that. I was just having a conversation with somebody the other day. Like, there was a guy at a party I was with, and he was lamenting that his daughter doesn't want to be an architect or a lawyer or an engineer. She insists that she wants to be an artist. And I said, I don't know, man. Like, have you seen what's going on with lawyers and engineers? Like, those folks are getting fired left and right. Like, the output, the engineered output system kind of jobs are the ones that are going to get claimed first here. I think maybe a prolific, disciplined, creative mind is the best possible one to carry into this new world. That's the mind that can get turbocharged by these technologies and do more and more fascinating things. But if we continue to train people as if their whole job is output, the way the educational system has lately, I think that's going to be a real problem. And I really think of the non-college educated women, for instance, for whom jobs like admin, bookkeeping, clerical work, those jobs, if we wipe those jobs out, I don't know what those women are going to do. I think, I have a friend who says that, this could do to non-college educated women what offshoring did to non-college educated men. In that it wiped out manufacturing jobs. Just the ruinous effects on that whole slice of the population, which is what, to me, brings us to what an organization should, in theory, do, which is, if you're worried about a rot in the deliberative and critical faculties of your people, then it's not going to work for you to wipe out the first couple of jobs available at your organization, the first two levels of jobs. If entry level and that second level work disappear, you're never going to have anybody qualified for that vital third role, where you're managing somebody or you're running a complex sales process or any of the stuff that is hard and human. And so I think that, like, at the very moment that this system tempts us to just do away with all of these deliberative training processes, is when we're going to need them more than ever. And I think it's the people who double down and say, you know what, I'm going to create like an apprenticeship program where people come and learn the essentials of being a professional, even if the output isn't valuable yet to the organization. That's the thing, this quarter by quarter assessment of output, because if you just do what these companies say their systems are built to do, we're going to take that away from everybody. And that is a thing that really, I want to shake the world by the shoulders around that one.
With a lot of the guests that we've had, we get to hear a lot of different perspectives and views, and I add up in my head, connect the dots with patterns that I'm beginning to see, and given I'm in numerous walks of life, I like to take some of the lessons and apply them to the teams of people. And it does seem several rungs of the ladder have been deleted. I'm thinking, what would that mean to people trying to do something? And there's a couple of thoughts, and I am a little random, but I'm just going to put these thoughts out there. One, it seems a lot of people will suffer because the careers that they thought were how it would work, and others will create their own careers and will have the opposite effect, where they realize the opportunity is not for them to go somewhere else, but they can create their own opportunity very, very, very quickly in a way that it wasn't achievable before. But if you look at how life is constructed and societies, that tends to be 10%. And a podcast guest who's a good friend who was ran effectively training for the British SAS. For when he ran selection, it was always the same math. And he was dealing with effectively elite people or elite performance soldiers who came from different regiments, irrespective of their socioeconomic background. Usually they were from a poorer background, to be honest. But it was the same proportion. Those who had that mental grit and determination, that even though they weren't the strongest, they weren't the fastest, they weren't the biggest, they weren't the most talented, but they had the mentality to do it. That elite mindset would get them through. So irrespective of background, we're probably going to see people who would maybe have never had a chance before become extremely high achievers. We've done some experiments where we've taken non-experienced people, very experienced people, people completely fresh into work, and very experienced people, and used a kind of empathetic approach to say, right, trained barrister, lawyer, you need to understand how the sales guys work, very experienced sales guys, but you also need to spend time with new graduates who haven't got a clue how the world works, but are deep into their technology. But you also need to work with the designer to understand what his process is. But then you've got to spend time with some customers to understand what their daily life is like and what problems they actually have. And in many ways, to force people to consider, understand why and how everyone else makes their decisions. And what you tend to find within a short space of time, you can use AI to collaborate to put people in each other's shoes. And then that empathetic approach makes them think in a way that they would not usually think. So in many ways, it's like, get out of your mindset, consider others. You see dialogue become better, you see ideas come better, you see excitement. Someone who would in a normal walk of life say, no, you are siloed over here, can have a conversation, come up with an idea, someone go, oh, that's interesting, how about this? And they get excited, they see it.
Yeah.
And you begin to build this momentum. And it's almost like you create an equality where it doesn't matter about privilege and roles. Yes, people have the responsibility that they have, but to really create a team ethic where, yes, you get results, but you get creativity, you get ideas, and people have each other's backs. They're considering. It reduces the amount of like, why isn't that done? Why isn't that done? Because, okay, because of AI, you can now understand what it would take to put a contract together. In many ways, creating a micro symbiotic apprentice methodology where at least everyone can become everyone else's apprentice, irrespective of age as well. And I think there's something really to be said about getting someone in their 50s, spending good time with someone in their 20s and thinking,
Sure.
How do you think? Why do you look at the world this way? Well, how would you think about it? And then people recognize, actually, whilst the majority of all of what we are, believe, see as a human is the same, we can see it from very different perspectives, and there are reasons why. And that empathy allows people to progress, be happier at what they do, have more respect, engage in conversation, and question things. Think, why? Why this? Why that? I think that's something that every business and just society in general would do very well.
Yes.
To really practice, and AI could help with that. And that's the opposite side to the really negative side. And so if we're aware of the really negative connotations, then suddenly people that we look at and say, well, no, they would never be any good. Actually, a lot of people could be very good, and they do bring things to the table, and it's putting value on the human experience, a human's experience, the ability to work as teams, to help each other think, to question each other, and to really open our eyes. And that's almost despite ending up in the position we've ended up today. And in many ways, perhaps it is on us and for people in general to take a bit of control and say, yes, there are bad things happening.
Yeah.
But what good can we make of it? And respect and empathize that it will be hard for some, it will be easier for others, but we're all in this together, effectively.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, what you're describing, I've talked to several organizations about what it is to put your junior people and any automated systems you're considering using in their work together with your senior people and create a kind of, it's almost like a competitive gaming sort of system. Not quite competitive, because I don't think your senior people will want that, but it's almost that, where you're essentially comparing the long human experience to what these systems are pushing, and in the process getting your senior and junior people to try and bond in the midst of that, such that perhaps the junior person is helping the senior person absolve themselves of some of the work they don't want to have to do. There's some help, there's some new teaming you could imagine making that would both make your people more efficient, but also create the opportunity for there to be a genuine, not just exchange of information, but a genuine, as you say, a building of empathy. I mean, the thing that I keep coming back to is just the way in which I just keep coming back to the sort of the ground truth of how our brains are built for, optimal social functioning. And it's the great irony of our moment that the very moment that we were having the greatest breakthroughs in understanding how we connect to one another and make choices, along comes a technology that is poised to possibly wipe out both. It's a really sad irony. So I think about, like, there's this incredible research from an academic named Beatrice de Gelder. She did this incredible work where she was trying to, she was following in the footsteps of a lot of much older work, almost century-old work, in which doctors had basically looked at people who'd had their optic nerve cut in some form. Typically, this was in the old days during World War I because of some horrible injury. It was a very gruesome kind of thing. But at that time, all kinds of weird anecdotal reports would come through about people seeing things sort of out of temporal order. They would have things that even though they were in theory blind, they can't see anymore, they would have these images come into their brains, and it turned out that they were perhaps images from a few hours past, and all kinds of weird stuff. So anyway, de Gelder got very interested in this stuff, and she began to do experiments with people who had had the same sort of effect, but from a stroke that had cut off the optic nerve. And she was bringing these folks in and doing these various experiments, and they weren't working. She was doing like ventriloquism and all kinds of stuff, and it just wasn't working. And one day during a break, just for the heck of it, she and her team put a little obstacle course together in this hallway for this guy who had arrived with the help of his wife. He's got a cane, the whole thing. And they say, could you please walk down this hallway? And they take the cane from him, and he makes his way forward, and he stops at the first wastebasket that's set in his way. And he turns sideways and makes his way around it. And then he gets to the end of the hallway, having not touched any of the obstacles, clearly having picked his way through it the way a seeing person would have. And everybody gasps and says, how did you do that? And his answer was, do what? Just like the you and me driving our kid to the school by accident, this guy had walked through this obstacle course without his consciousness being consulted in any way. And this is even though he literally cannot consciously see. His vision is just a big blackness in front of him. So it's this breakthrough moment. And then she begins doing other sorts of experimentation. And one of them was she put folks with his affliction in front of a big screen and showed them images of faces, big human faces, making either emotional signs, either smiling very big or frowning very pronounced. And then she'd ask them afterwards, what do you see? What did you see? And they would all say, I didn't see anything. I keep telling you, I'm blind. Why are you bothering me like this? But what they also did was rig up the patient's faces with these little sensors that could detect the micromusculature of the face. And it turns out when you show somebody a smiling person, that blind person begins smiling. Their face wants to smile back. You show them a frowning person, they start to frown back. And what this is she thinks, first of all, some sort of new way, because again, these are people for whom the eye is functioning correctly and the brain is functioning correctly, but the connection that we know optic information moves through is cut. So there's some other thing that these people are catching visually, and we don't know what it is, right? So here's another version of this. There's a guy, a neuroscientist at Stanford University near where I live, who I have worked with in the past, and he does all kinds of experimentation with people where, with what he calls it what he does is he'll bring people together and have them play a game. Strangers will play a game together, and then he'll sick them on a task, and then a control group he'll just bring them in and throw them at the task cold. And as you would imagine, no surprise, the people who play the game first always do the task better. And we have no idea why. He calls it the dark matter of human interaction. We are observing for the first time these incredible connections that we are somehow magically making. But I mean, it's really borders on the magical between people at the very moment that we're building this weird simulacrum of our thinking and of our choices and of our connection with others, this thing that comes along and talks to you in the first person and compliments you whenever you ask it a question. It's a scary moment and it's a tough thing, but it is for me having these enormous breakthroughs right when this industry is coming along saying, you don't need colleagues. Sam Altman famously said in 2024 that he and his friends have this bet going as to when we'll see the first $1 billion one-person company. And, he said that as if that would be cool. And putting aside whether or not that would be ruinous for any economy, because we don't all get to be billionaires in that economy, it's just bad neurologically to work alone all the time. It's not, it doesn't make the most of what is clearly the magic of being on a team that science is just starting to show us. So I want us to be excited about human connection in a new way. I'm hoping that this moment will teach us to value that in a new way, because I think we're about to see what happens when you go without it for too long.
But in many ways, is that a little like being in isolation? Like if you can't have something that you've taken for granted, and where these systems have created a circumstance where, and I think we need to take other things in consideration. So the pandemic was a big fueler of that. For example, everyone could stay at home, people could be alone for a while. Now the live music scene is better. People spending time together in coffee shops, the need for community, the need for interaction has almost started to become valuable again. And in many ways, if the goal is the attention economy, to have your attention all the time, then the strength that it holds over you dissipates. I mean, I did an experiment once. So in the UK, we have things called dime bars. Used to be commercials about it, and I think people that ate them were considered a bit dim, but I love them. And I thought, I love them so much, I'm just going to eat loads of dime bars. And after 100, I didn't want another dime bar. So the incredible appetite that I had for these little chocolates literally was killed with enough of it. In many ways, I'm beginning to see this more and more often. The ultimate goal and outcome of the attention economy and social media, where you don't trust anything anymore, almost kills itself, and the objective destroys its own outcome.
Hmm.
Because if we don't believe anything, we mistrust it, then it loses its value, it loses its magic, it loses its appeal, and it becomes just throwaway superfluous. At which point, what we crave
Hmm.
is the human connection. The only thing that we can trust is things that we can touch and see. And even in the AI
Hmm.
age, I think what we're going to see is source of truth. I mean, you're a journalist. The BBC at one point was incredibly credible. You trusted it because it was the BBC. You trusted various different networks, irrespective of any political leanings as such, because it was the trusted news source. It was something that had credibility. So whoever reported anything within a particular trusted entity, of course, a lot of that is now gone. But when all of that goes, people just don't listen anymore. And then it becomes the human experience again. So I think in many ways, ironically, the more nefarious, pure control leads to a lack of control. It takes time to play out, but I'm seeing all the signs that that's the case. So those who will end up using AI and creating content, the artistic, the creators. I mean, people watch YouTubers because they like that YouTuber. If it's on that official channel, other people can do AI slop. They can do all sorts of things, but you trust the original. And in many ways, you trust the human, the relationship. I mean, it's so underplayed, and I think it's been so overplayed, it will by default lead to something very, very positive. It's just you have to go through the rough times. It's like you have to eat the 100 dime bars before you lose the taste.
Yeah, and I think you'll need to have a few bold leaders who look at all of the temptations laid in front of them in this moment and say, you know what? I think there's going to be, I mean, I've given up on believing that people just want to be on the right side of history because I don't think that's as true anymore as it maybe once was. But I do think people want to make good strategic decisions in the long term. And one of them is, I think if you become the kind of organization that just races to the bottom with efficiency, you're going to wind up in the place that you and I have sort of been talking about this whole conversation, where you just don't have people who can make choices, right? You don't have a kid who can make himself dinner at home by himself. You know, you're in a totally different kind of world. But the folks who can say, you know, I'm going to defend a little bit of the decision making and the agency in my organization, you know, that can I think can truly be a sort of a competitive set. I mean, you know, for most of history, you know, the way you built a great organization was that you found great people, and I think that AI companies are going to try and trick you into thinking that you can just do away with that.
So the future, two directions: pure cloud based or local
Hmm.
private compute.
Well, I mean, we talk in the United States a lot of there's a lot of dogma in the U.S. about how we have to compete with China, and that China, you know, is our greatest geopolitical enemy around, you know, and that we need to take all the regulation off of AI so that we can compete with China. So you hear politicians making that argument. But one thing I will say for China is that they've done an incredible job of creating some very efficient, very lean models that don't require the hyperscaled compute that these American companies have really dug themselves into an enormous financial hole buying and putting together. So I think the cloud compute model that we are in right now, which is going to necessitate these Manhattan-sized buildings that suck up the power of a city each day, I think that model is unsustainable. And I think that either the sort of circular financing, this weird financing we're seeing where $10 billion is just getting passed from one company to the next in a big circle, I think that can't last. And I think that in the end, in the same way that we saw mainframes go to PCs and we saw, you know, huge satellites go to these little 4-inch satellites that are now the norm for researchers, you're going to see a collapsing down of this. And, in spite of what, Andy Jassy at AWS and all of these companies are going to be trying to tell you, I think that people, the fact that folks are running a bot, like, running bots on a little Mac Mini now is a sign of what can happen in the future. And so I think that the cloud thing is unsustainable financially, and economically, and we've seen from China that it can be done another way. So I think we're going to be pushing to a smaller and smaller and more local form of that going forward.
Excellent. I would agree. One of the final questions is, what do you think is going to happen in the next 12 to 24 months with the real advent of AI as it's beginning to roll out, in a positive, negative, everything on the table basis?
Well, I think we've seen a little preview of it with this episode that took place here in the United States recently, with the release of a thing it was called Claudebot for a time, and then became a thing called OpenClaw. So this is a thing that a guy made in his bedroom. A guy named Peter Steinberger built this thing, and it was basically a sort of all-in-one agentic piece of AI that you would install either on a little like subset of your computer, or what people have really been doing is going out and buying little Mac Minis en masse. Buying a Mac Mini in the Bay Area is really hard right now because everybody's just putting these things on there. And what you do is you run this agent on there. You give it it's a crazy idea. You basically give it a phone number, an email address, and access to your whole life, your bank account, your Anthropic computing credits, everything. And you let it just run wild. You say, here's what I'm trying to do, and it just goes. And this is a no breaks kind of agentic experiment. And more than 100,000 people went ahead and did this, just gave this thing access to their lives and ran wild with it. And on the one hand, some amazing things were able to happen. I played around with it a little bit, and it was an amazing sort of intelligence gathering system for a moment. But then it started to do other stuff that I didn't feel comfortable with. It started accessing parts of my life that I didn't want it to, and so I shut that thing down. Other people, at one point, somebody used it to make a social media platform just for other bots. And they all began getting on there and fighting with one another and complaining about the humans together. And it was this incredible explosion. It was like a Monty Python sketch. It was ridiculous, ludicrous, the kind of conversations that were taking place inside this platform. And OpenAI has now hired that guy and made this promotional video about how smart he is and how great it was. And I think the episode sort of tells us a little something about how there's a certain category of, argue, pretty careless people who are only too happy to let this thing run wild in their lives. And I think there's going to be more and more experimentation along those lines. I think you're seeing these companies become more and more, I would argue, reckless in this stuff, experimenting on everybody live. I mean, the New York Times just came out with a big report that showed that Meta, parent company of Facebook, has these Ray-Ban glasses with the cameras built into them, and there's an internal memo from Meta that shows that they've been looking at the possibility of using moments when everyone is distracted by other political crises to debut an all-in-one facial recognition system for everybody in the world, essentially. This is the kind of moves these companies are moving in very big and bold ways. And I feel like they're emboldened in a way that has not been true in quite some time. And so I think you're going to see some very reckless moves in the next 12 to 18 months, and a lot of marketing that tries to convince organizations that you should just go for it. Let it burn, the kids say, raw dog the world, And I think that is that is going to hold a number of very scary and important lessons for people trying to run a real organization. At the same time, I think over the next 12 to 18 months, you're also going to see some case studies come out where people I think are going to very quickly realize, oh, I needed more humans working here than I thought. And I needed more on the job experience in this organization than I thought. And for me, there's going to be some, less sexy headlines about pilot programs in which, as we say, as we've been describing here, an apprentice is put together with a senior person and AI facilitates that relationship in some way and builds institutional knowledge that everybody can benefit from. Those things are not going to make the headlines, and those things are not going to get the kind of marketing treatment that these other things are going to get. But I think it's those sorts of experiments over the next 12 to 18 months that are going to determine the an effective way of using this stuff. I don't believe there's going to be a white collar jobs apocalypse in the short term. Or at the very least, I think that even if companies lay off a lot of people, they're going to very quickly learn that they need those people back. I don't think these systems are in any way qualified to replace the kind of deliberative strengths that we've been talking about here. So I think you're going to see some reckless experimentation and some very reasonable experimentation. And I think the reckless experimentation is going to have a couple of lessons, some that we won't want. And the reasonable experimentation, I think, could actually build a real use case for this stuff that makes businesses stronger.
Excellent. And on that note, Jake, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate you.